G'day and welcome back to another episode of Painting Oathsworn. In today's episode, we'll be painting the priest and learning how to paint white and stone. Now, white can be one of the more challenging colours to paint, as you can't follow your normal process of shading and highlighting in the same way. Instead, what we need to do is focus on the environmental colours that are around it and use those in the white to help create a more natural looking colour. Sometimes that will result in a cool looking white, and sometimes it will result in a warm looking white. Both of those are interesting and both of those are quite fun to paint. Now personally, I find painting rocks and stones to be one of the most fun things you can do. It is always interesting how many colours and textures you find in real rocks. Very rarely are rocks grey. And so my approach towards painting stone is to incorporate a lot of those interesting colours and nuances. As I said, it's great fun. For the overlay colour on the priest, we will be using a dark blue, and that will help create a nice cold white to work with. Let's get started. So as I mentioned in the introduction, painting white is often about the colours that are around the figure as opposed to the actual white itself. If you look at photos of things that are wearing white cloth or white objects in photos, you'll notice that they reflect a lot of the environmental colours. So the colours that I have selected here have a little bit of warmth in the yellow and the deck tan, which are both warmer colours. But the main colour and the colour we'll be using to build up the basic tones is a pastel blue. So broadly speaking, I've chosen blue for this figure's overlay colour for no reason other than I wanted to use blue. And that's one of the most fun things about painting figures is the experimentation. Sometimes you'll use a colour or try a technique purely because you want to. And I think that's the most fun and interesting way to paint figures, as it will really expand your ability to work with unfamiliar situations and unfamiliar colours and unfamiliar techniques. I've talked in an article I wrote a few years ago about the comfort zone, and most people are familiar with the term the comfort zone in the context of miniature painting. So one concept that is a little bit more uncommonly known than the comfort zone is a zone called the panic zone, and then a zone that sits between the comfort zone and the panic zone, which I'll talk about in a second. So the interesting thing about the comfort zone is we don't ever really develop or grow our skill set when we stick within the comfort zone. So if you only stick to techniques that you're familiar with, that you're comfortable with, the likelihood that you'll progress and improve and develop as a painter is pretty minimal. There'll be some growth, things like brush control, ability to determine the dilution of a paint, or just general technical proficiencies will improve. But you won't find yourself improving into a new stratosphere. It will mostly remain pretty similar, your skill level. I guess what most people would think I'm saying when I recommend that is that you move straight out and pick up a model and decide to do non-metallic metal and all sorts of other crazy techniques. And that's just not the case, because when you do something that's too far out of your comfort zone, you move into a zone called the zone of panic. Now obviously this is not you're going to jump up from your painting table and run away screaming at the top of your lungs. Instead, it's just a situation that is causing you to not react in the way that we want, which is in a positive and open way. Instead, you tend to shut down and dive into fight or flight response. So this is a normal panic zone response. When humans get into unfamiliar situations, they immediately move to that. So in real terms, what it means is rather than your brain absorbing information and sort of recalling these new techniques, instead, all you're really going to remember is that it made you feel really uncomfortable trying something new and that you don't want to experience that again. So the key to learning, the key to this sort of situation is the in-between zone, and it's called the zone of learning. So when you are in the zone of learning, what's happening is your brain is creating new neural pathways to forge new connections, to give you new skills. And this is a really crucial part of growth and development and life, I guess, is pushing yourself a little bit, but not so far that you get into the panic zone, that you can begin to experience new things, start developing those new skills, and eventually those skills will become a part of your comfort zone. So you're slowly but surely expanding your circle of comfort, allowing you to feel more confident in techniques such as non-metallic metal, OSL, or even painting white or black. So the reason I've gone on to this discussion about comfort zone and the panic zone is I think it's a really crucial part of learning to actually step yourself out and into some more challenging paint jobs. Don't step too far, but definitely push yourself a little bit further than you think. So we're moving into our first highlight color now, and this is a mixture of deck tan and the pastel blue. What we're trying to create with these highlight stages is a warm off-white. And to bring it back to the conversation about painting black, it's really difficult to shade black when black itself is the darkest possible color. So the key to creating enough room for yourself to shade and create a dark contrast is to use a grey as your midtone. Now with white, the exact same challenge presents itself in reverse, where we need to have a midtone that sits somewhere below pure white so that we leave ourselves some room to highlight up to white. So the colour that I've chosen for that midtone is deck tan, but you'll see a little bit later on that I'm also mixing in some yellow, some German yellow, and that is to create a sense of warmth and reinforce the somewhat green and sickly environment of the Deepwood that surrounds this figure. So I will be talking about painting fabric in a future episode. It's really a lot of fun to paint fabric. Often you're talking about big brush strokes, deep, long brush strokes, and using pretty thick paint to help build up those layers quickly. And in this instance, as deck tan is a paler colour, we are finding that we're needing to do a couple of layers to establish a solid colour. You can see I'm leaving a little bit of the blue and a little bit of each successive layer showing. And as I've discussed, it's a pretty common technique, layering up through these colours. What I find really nice about using a blue or a different colour for your overlay colour or your base coat is it creates a little sense of harmonisation across the whole piece. If you leave a little bit of that colour in the recesses, in the shadows of all the areas, then your figure tends to feel like it exists within the same environment in all areas. And that's just a nice way of tying all of the elements of a figure together. So as we're building up the layers of deck tan and pastel blue into these whites, you can start to see it taking shape. This is a really fantastic sculpt from Oathsworn. It's one of the coolest, I think, in the whole range. Really imposing stance, and some of the armory kits that he has as an upgrade are also really awesome and are going to create some fun things to paint. There's a little candelabra. Really excited about painting that. I wanted it to stand out pretty significantly from a lot of the other figures where I've gone for more muted colours generally by having this really bright and vibrant white. I feel like the priest, who is obviously a strong man of faith, standing out there and wielding his hammer and bringing the faith to all and sundry, would want to stand out and be the centre of attention. So using white for this model made a lot of sense to me. It's also a colour associated with faith and purity, so I felt like this would be a nice fit. So we move on to the next layer now, and as you can see, this is predominantly deck tan. I've mixed in a little bit of the pastel blue and a little bit of the yellow. This creates a really nice off-white grey colour, and you really will start to see this begin to look like white, even though we know it is not white. And it's all about tricking the eye and tricking your brain into believing that what they're seeing is white. Now, if you were to take a white paint and paint it on an area, what you get is a very unnatural looking colour. It doesn't feel like it fits in with the other values and the other contrast elements on the piece, because you have extremely high value, bright, intense colour sitting right next to colours that have got shading and highlighting. So the approach that we're trying to take here is create the sensation of white without actually using white until the very last step. So this colour, this deck tan and yellow mixture, is a really warm colour, which is going to create again the contrast with the colder blue, which is a little bit more interesting to look at than black highlighted all the way up to white through a variety of greys. So the placement of these lights is again very considered based on the zenithal prime. I'm always thinking about where is the light coming from, where is it going to hit this object, how much focus do I want to draw to this specific area. And sometimes there's a few occasions where I break the rules. One of those occasions is usually the bottom of fabric. I find it's really much more interesting when you have some highlights around the bottom and the edges of different fabric, so that you have a clear break separation of this one element versus the other elements. Now again, one of the things that you'll notice in this is my brush tends to move pretty quickly and tends to go where I tell it to most of the time. This is a practice, an experience. It is not something that you need to try and achieve, same as I do. All you need to focus on is making sure that you're getting the paint in the right area. And one of the ways that you can really control that is the small paper towel beside a palette, which you've seen in most of the shots of my palette. If you are struggling with control, just wipe a little bit more paint off so that you have less paint on your brush. That'll allow you to control where you're placing your paint a little bit more carefully. However, as I said in the last episode, that doesn't mean dilute your paint more. So this is pure deck tan. And you can see here that the exposure on this camera is reading this as very bright white. I am about to correct the exposure on the camera, so you will see the overall figure darken up, but also the background will darken up, so you'll know that I have adjusted the exposure. But this is a fine example of how something can look like it's white based on the environment around it. Even though we know this is deck tan and we know it's not white, it's coming off as a very bright and intense color. So I'm using a technique here which I've described in previous episodes as sketch and refine. And what I'm doing is I'm sketching in all of our highlights in key areas where I want the light to be placed. And I'll then come back in later and do some refining with, in my case, an airbrush. But that refine step can also be done with just a brush. And the way that you do that is by glazing. So I talked about glazing being a sort of technique that you need to know for this series. But to just give you a very quick definition of glazing, what we're doing is we're taking a dilute paint. We're wiping off the majority of the actual paint from our brush. And we're then placing those pigments across the surface of a transition. So the transition is obviously the area between two colours, two layers. And that dilute paint will deposit pigment randomly and unevenly across the transition, very, very, very slowly diffusing the edges of that transition. Glazing is often a technique that doesn't make a lot of sense early on because you don't actually see too much of a change from your first attempts on glazing, because usually it takes 2 or 3 layers of a glaze before you start to see an impact. So that's the golden rule with glazing, is patience. Going back to the paper towel beside your palette, if you've wiped off enough paint onto your palette, from your palette onto your paper, then what you'll find is that this glaze will only take a few seconds to dry because you're not flooding the area with paint. So usually what you want to try and do is build up all the stages of a layer, or all of your highlight stages, and then coming back in and glazing towards the end of a process. Now, as I've talked about, I do this glazing with my airbrush, and it's effectively the same thing. What we're doing is we're filtering the color. So here is my airbrush glaze, and this is mixing in a little bit of that AK off-white in with the deck tan. And this layer is going to filter each of those colors. So you could replicate this absolutely with a brush. So what we're seeing here is all of these little particles of paint be deposited on the areas where the light's going to be hitting. You'll notice I'm targeting the airbrush in the raised areas. I'm not aiming it down the bottom of the model. I'm mostly focusing on the upper portions and really concentrating that light in those areas. So this is almost the lightest color that we're going to put on the figure. We're going to do some tiny little highlights with this deck tan and white mixture at the very last stage. So, as I've talked about, the environment, I want it to play a really big part in the story of these figures. And so for me, the environment is all about weathering, texturing, and detail on the figure. So I've mixed in 3 colors here. These are 3 contrast paints. And what I'm doing is making all of these areas on the white reflect a little bit of green. So I'm not focusing this really in a specific way, other than trying to create some unnatural tones in the white as if it's reflecting the environment around. Now, one thing I think it's really crucial to know at this point is that this figure does not look finished and it does not look right because all of those other elements are unpainted. So this green is coming across a little bit too much, but as we begin to fill in other layers of the model and other sections alongside this white and green tinge, we're really going to start to see that it fits a little bit more harmoniously alongside the rest of the model. I love contrast paints. I think they're an amazing product. Having said that, this can be replicated with an ink. The only issue you may come across is inks can dry really shiny. The contrast paints have a similar problem on occasion. My solution to a shiny finish is to use a varnish, which I do recommend for all figures that are going to be used on a tabletop anyway. And so the shiny factor becomes less of a concern when you're using a varnish layer. So you can see I'm starting to increase the intensity of the contrast paint and putting it down around the edges. All right, let's move on to our highlight. All of those layers have dried. As you can see, we've painted the facial details now. We've started to block in some of the other colors in black. And what we're doing now is the final edge highlight. And this is with deck tan and off-white. I talked a little bit in the last episode with the Kerr about adding little scratches and little micro details, about trying to reinforce the idea of a really lived and worn world. And so you'll often see I add little dots, little stipples on all sorts of areas of the figure, including this fabric. And you'll see I'll add some little spots up around the top of the head, just of this white colour, rather than trying to be very perfect. These scratches make it look a lot more interesting. Because the face is the focal point of the figure, this face is tucked under a hood, so that can sometimes create a sense of lacking connection with the figure. This is usually more prevalent in larger figures as opposed to gaming figures, but most people are drawn to the face of a model. So I find that when we have this hood or a hood over a figure, I want to increase the intensity of the light around that area so that models are really drawn into the face. So you can see I've put a lot of white edging around that hood. No doubt you just saw the exposure change, and so you can see how much of a difference that's made to the overall appearance. One of the challenges of filming and photography of miniature figures. But this is a really nice example of how light is influencing our eyes and tricking our eyes into seeing different colours, and really how much an area can look like white and be very, very far away from white. And that was it. So let's move on to stone. I talked at the start about painting stone as being one of the most fun things to do, and that is because stone has so much natural variance that it's very rarely grey. Stone is often brown, green, all sorts of different tones, and I think when you try to replicate that in miniature form, you get much more alive and dynamic looking rocks and stone elements. There's a lot of great sculpting on these figures, and I particularly love this hammer. We've started with a dark sea blue, and we're now mixing in German yellow. So these two colours will create a greyish tone, but as always, it's a much more alive looking grey than you would get if you mixed black and white. And if you look at a lot of pre-mixed grey colours, they do tend towards that very bluish grey. And I think with these figures, we want it to be a little bit more greeny grey. I've talked about environment a lot. I won't explain any further why I think that needs to be the case. You could start with a brown. You could start with a green. You could even start with, as I showed in the last episode, a purple. And all of these colours will work perfectly fine as your base tone for stone. As we've mixed in more of this German yellow and a little bit of deck tan, we're starting to get a more cold greenish grey, which we're going to use to create some texture. When I painted leather in the last episode, you would have seen a lot of small strokes, really thinking about the direction of the light and the direction of the distressing of the object itself. Now with rock, you really don't even need to think about that. Lots of irregular strokes, shapes, all of these little micro details will help reinforce the natural and uneven form that rocks will take. I challenge you to find any two rocks that look the same. I challenge you to find any two rocks that look the same colour. It's one of the wonders of nature. So I think painting rocks just comes down to being more free and using more natural, warm, varied colours rather than just sticking with a straight up and down grey. So all of these little steps are with a pretty opaque colour. We're not diluting this colour much because we want to create strong contrast. But you can see how all of those little brush strokes, as we're beginning to add more and more of the light so what we're doing now is adding even more detail and starting to leave little spots, little marks, little indentations in the rock. I think the reason I enjoy this so much is because the real freedom that you can have when you're painting this type of object. I have painted quite a number of display figures with big bases that are filled with rock shapes and textures. And I've painted rocks for hours and hours and hours on end and had an absolute ball, because you never feel like it's difficult, laborious, painstakingly controlled work. You always feel like you're just having fun. Your brush is just flowing all over the place, adding interesting elements. And I think that is why I enjoy it so much. So you can start to see how I am beginning to concentrate more in areas where the light is going to hit this surface, because we do want to continue to reinforce the zenithal prime. As always, to add some saturation and some interest, we're going to use these contrast paints. In case you hadn't clicked, this is the same footage as I used earlier in the episode. We're going to mix in a little bit of green. And I find one of the more fun ways to use contrast paints is to actually mix them on the figure. So a technique that I'll talk about a little bit more in the next episode called wet in wet. But what we're going to do is take one contrast color and apply it to the model, and then mix in other contrast paints while it's still wet. I'll talk about that more in the next episode. So now our rock face is distressed. It's got nuance and color. We're now going to add the highlights. And so we're mixing in the German yellow and some AK off-white into our highlight color. Now what you're probably noticing is that these colors are starting to be a little bit similar to the colors we highlighted the white with. That's because what we want is for all of the colors on this figure to feel very harmonious, like it's existing in the same environment. I think it's really a normal approach when people are starting to learn to paint. When you're thinking about highlighting a color, you grab your shade, you grab your highlight, and then you paint that color. However, as I've progressed in miniature painting, I've begun to work more with the same color for highlights across a whole figure, because it really reinforces that sensation of environment, that overall harmony of the figure. So even though it's the same color, you can see there's still a different feel to this stone versus the white, because we have the underlying colors being pretty different. So these highlights really focused on the upper areas, really focused on the areas where the light would hit. We're again adding scratches, adding detail, really making sure that we're separating the rock from the metal. And that brings to a close this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. In the next episode, we will be painting the Ranger, and we will be talking about wood. What else? I look forward to seeing you then. Big dinner.